Welcome to Hercules, the Roman version of our universal hero. With the GCSE, we are going to study this version of Hercules. So he's the same hero, but he's slightly different. And we kind of are looking for what makes him different as we look at the sources and resources for this unit. So we're going to be making notes on the links to the Greek myths and the Roman versions of later myths. When I say later, I mean after the Labours, which are the most popular of the myths about Heracles or Hercules. The ritual worship of the cult of Hercules in Rome. We're going to be looking at why that came about, according to myth or legend, and how it was done. How the ritual actually started, so the sort of origin story of that ritual, the details of the ritual, and then we're going to be looking at some prescribed sources, or at least I am with my class in class. If you're watching along with us, I won't be going through the sources, but I will be giving a summary of them, and you can maybe read them on your own at home. We're going to be looking at Virgil's Aeneid, Book 8, the story of Hercules versus Cacus, and we're going to be reading Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book 9, the lesser adventures and death of Hercules. So yes, the lesser adventures or the later adventures, probably a slightly unfair name too, but they don't really seem as grandiose as the Labours. They don't contain quite so many monsters and legendary heroes and so forth. First of all, the links to the Greek myths. We know that the Romans somewhat inherited Greek ideas about the gods, and they so also inherited the myths that went with them. Ancient Greek culture was around well before Rome was founded, and the Greek pantheon, the Olympians as we know them, seems to have been carried over to Italy by migrants and refugees and adapted over time to reflect more Roman views and values. That's why the Roman versions of the Olympian gods have slightly different names, and maybe they have slightly different responsibilities which more highlight Roman views and values. Hercules, or Heracles originally, he does become an important Roman god. In fact, you tend to see Hercules as their sort of equivalent of Jesus Christ, that kind of thing, when they're swearing. So they swear by Hercules. And the reason is he's a mortal man who was deified and who represented both strength and intelligence. He's a pretty good role model, as we explored in the Greek version of Heracles. Roman poets wrote versions of the stories of Hercules, and in fact a lot of the stories of the myths that we have do actually come from these Roman poets rather than the Greek poets. A lot of the ancient Greek tradition was in fact oral. Only some were written down by later Greek poets, but the Roman poets kind of went to town on them, really. So we do get an awful lot of stories of myths that actually come from the Roman tradition rather than the Greek tradition. The poet Ovid wrote a narrative poem called Metamorphoses, or Metamorphoses Libri, the Books of Transformations. Sounds rather exciting, doesn't it? And this aimed to chart the history of the world through mythical stories of love and transformation, things being turned into other things. And this sort of carried through from the creation of the world up to the deification of Julius Caesar, the famous dictator of Rome, who was unfortunately, for him anyway, assassinated and then deified. And his death, people argue, sort of ended up creating what became the Roman Empire with his adopted son Octavius, who became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. And you can kind of see why a Roman poet who was living during the period of time that Augustus was the first emperor might well want to write a poem that leads up to the deification of Julius Caesar to show the popularity of Julius Caesar. And that is a transformation from a mortal man to a god. So you can see how including Hercules, who also becomes a god, would be quite appropriate within this group of stories. Now, in the course, we've already read Ovid's story about Orpheus and Eurydice, the Orpheus in the underworld story. So Orpheus is sort of transformed because he goes from a husband to a widow. He goes from a mortal person to going into the underworld, although he doesn't actually die. Unfortunately, Eurydice is transformed from a living person into a dead person, and then does not get to be transformed from a dead person into a living person again. But, Orpheus does try. The poet Virgil also writes about Hercules. Virgil wrote the epic poem The Aeneid, another piece of Augustan period poetry. And this was the story of how the Trojan refugees came to Italy under their leader Aeneas and founded a city that would be a precursor to Rome itself. So it's rather like the Iliad Part 2, only it's very anti-Greek in its sentiment. It's all about in the Iliad. And in fact, it's the Aeneid that's got a chapter about the Trojan horse. It is a very popular story. It doesn't show the Greeks to be particularly nice. And the poor old Trojans trudge around until they finally get to Italy and they manage to found their city, which is called Lavinia, after Lavinia, his new wife that he marries there. And then that city goes on to have colonists who found Alba Longa, and then 2 young chaps from Alba Longa, Romulus and Remus, go on to found Rome. So it becomes this precursor to Rome. And even though Aeneas doesn't found Rome, he is seen as this ancient founder. And he's really important as well because he's got quite an important mum, Venus, right? So, the Romans did rather like attaching their own mythology to the gods. It makes you look really great if you've got gods in your mix. The ritual of Hercules worship in Rome comes about through this origin story, which is in the Aeneid, from the Hercules and Cacus story. Virgil's Aeneid tells the story of how Hercules came to be worshipped in Rome by linking it with the story of Hercules and Cacus, which is one of the prescribed sources that we'll read later. Both pieces of information, how Hercules came to be worshipped and what the ritual is, can be found in Book 8 of the Aeneid. When the Trojan hero Aeneas, who we were just talking about, has arrived in Italy, he travels to Pallanteum, the city of Evander, who is a king. He is a Greek refugee from Arcadia who has established a city here on what will become the future site of Rome. There's quite a fun bit earlier on in the chapter where Virgil's going, yes, look around, just shepherd huts now, where once, or in the future, the forum will stand. And it's quite exciting. Evander, when Aeneas arrives, is in the middle of performing the ritual to Hercules, which is obviously very convenient for the story because it allows Virgil to then go, you asked me what I'm doing. Well, here we go, says Evander. And so he explains the rites and the origin story to Aeneas. That's allowing the poet Virgil to include this story of Hercules in the story of the founding of Rome, even though they're not really attached to each other. It's kind of nice that Rome was also the site of when Hercules was here once. Again, very convenient. But Virgil is making more of a point. He's really trying to link Hercules more clearly with Rome itself, making him more Roman and perhaps a bit less Greek so that the Romans can have that to be proud of. So let's have a look at that section. So this is a little bit of the prescribed source, the Hercules versus Cacus source, how the Roman ritual of Heracles worship came about and was performed, and it's explained at the end of the set section. Because of that, this rite is celebrated. Evander is talking here, as you can see by the speech marks. And happy posterity remembers the day. And Potitius the first, the founder, with the Pinarian house as guardians of the worship of Hercules, set up this altar, which he's probably pointing to the altar, in the grove, which shall be spoken of forever by us as the mightiest, as in it's the mightiest altar, because it refers to Hercules. And the mightiest it shall be forever. Come now, O you young men, he's talking to the Trojans with Aeneas who've turned up. Wreathe your hair with leaves, hold out wine cups in your right hands in honour of such great glory, and call on the god we know, meaning Hercules, and pour out the wine with a will. He, Evander, king of the Arcadians, original inhabitor of the site of Rome, spoke, while grey-green poplar veiled his hair with Hercules' own shade, hanging down in a knot of leaves, and the sacred cup filled his hand. Quickly they all poured a joyful libation on the table and prayed to the gods. So that's at the end of the set section, Virgil's Aeneid, Book 8, lines 268-279. Let's look at this a bit more closely. So what does the text tell us with the details of the ritual? Did we spot those? So first of all, wreathe your hair with leaves. That's something you need to do. So Romans and Greeks were quite keen on wearing wreaths of different types of leaves on their heads in order to symbolise something. The most famous of these are probably the laurel wreaths, and they symbolise victory, and that's why they would wear them after they'd won games, and why later on that became a symbol of the Caesars, the laurel crown. This is a poplar crown. It says later on it's Hercules' own shade. So poplar leaves apparently were sacred to Hercules, and so they wound them into a crown, a wreath, and put them on their head. Then we have hold out wine cups in your right hands. So you hold your wine cup in your right hand. Your right hand is generally seen as the stronger hand. Sorry to all you lefties out there. But the left hand was generally used as the hand you did things in the bathroom with. They did not have toilet paper, my dears. So it wasn't seen as the hand you would use in polite conversation. You wouldn't shake the left hand, for example. And it's also the hand that people traditionally held their sword in, because that means if everyone holds it in that hand and their shield in the left, and they're making a line, they can protect the person next to them. So it makes sense for everyone to hold it in the same hand. Again, sorry for any lefties. Then Hercules' name gets called out. Call on the god we know and pour out the wine with a will. And pour a joyful libation on the table or the altar here. Pour out the wine with a will, Evander says earlier. This is pouring a libation, which is a drink offering on the altar. What else have we got here? Well, Potitius the First, the founder with the Pinarian house as guardians of the worship of Hercules, that tells us who this ritual was actually started by, a man called Potitius and Pinarius. They headed up the Potitii and Pinarii families. And so originally those families were the ones who were responsible for making sure the worship of Hercules went ahead. Later, this changed to a specific group of slaves in about 312 BC. We are told Hercules was sacred to all men, women, children, and slaves as well. And gladiators, people who either were sold into slavery or sold themselves into that slavery, they were, of course, very much devoted to Hercules. You can see why. He's a great warrior. And when they got their freedom, if they got their freedom, they would get a wooden sword. And traditionally, those swords of freedom were then hung in the temple to Hercules, the victor, which I will show you on another slide. We've also got the altar in the grove. So this ritual should be done at the place where it was started off, where an altar was created for the purpose. The great altar of Hercules, the mightiest, as the text tells us it is called. And this was apparently positioned between the Tiber River and the Palatine Hill in what became known as the Forum Boarium, which was the cattle market, where the temple to Hercules the victor was later built. So we can see here the text does in fact include proper details where and how to worship Hercules and who used to be in charge of it. Here's what the temple to Hercules the victor looks like in its location. You can see here in this map and in this sort of model where the temple of Hercules is. And it's quite an interesting temple because it is round. It looks rather like a sort of old Greek tholos temple, a round one. But it's not monopteral like a normal thoros. It's a peripteral temple. And it still stands, although as you can see there, it's had windows put in and so forth. And it does look a little bit rickety, like it would just fall over. It certainly has been restored quite a lot. But you can visit the temple there. You can go and look at it in the Forum Boarium. And in fact, one of the temples that you would have studied in some of the earlier topics of myth and religion are these particular temples. And the Temple of Fortuna Virilis, or the Temple of Portunus, as it was also known, is one of the temples that you will have looked at, the one that's kind of more of an average Roman temple. So if you are going to Rome at some point, when that's possible again, you could actually visit both of these in the same forum. Now let's look at some representations of Heracles in art. So let's think, what type of art is this? What does this show? How does it depict him? You're going to annotate the images if you've got them all. Just watch along with me and make notes. Here we have a statue as you can see, obviously, which is made of marble. And it shows two men, both very muscular. One is clearly dominating the other. He's standing over him and holding onto his hair. In fact, he's standing so over him that his legs are sort of over the bent legs of the figure underneath, who, as he is on the floor holding on to something, because perhaps, to take away from the pain of his hair being held, he clearly looks like he's been dominated or beaten in some kind of fight. Now, we can tell that this is Hercules, but we might not realise that this is actually Hercules and Cacus. This statue is from the Piazza della Signoria in Firenze, or Florence, and it's by the Florentine artist Baccio Bandinelli. And you can see from the dates there that it's actually a 16th century AD or CE statue. It's not actually Roman. We can see it's Hercules. There's a strong, well-built man. He's holding a club, which you might not have noticed because you can sort of see it face on here. And he appears to be defeating an enemy pretty easily and calmly. And we know that Hercules certainly did find it easy to take on his opponents. And in some of the metopes, we saw him looking quite calm. Although in a lot, we also saw him being quite violent. So it is quite interesting that the figure that we think is Hercules here, with the club as being the only thing to show it's him, really isn't being particularly violent. And it is meant to represent Hercules versus Cacus, but it looks a lot different to the story in the Aeneid. For example, here, Cacus is human. He's not a fire-breathing monster, as we'll find out in the text. So this is not actually Roman or classical, but it is based on classical Roman art. And as I said already, it's from the 16th century CE. It stands in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence. It is an important Italian city, and the piazza here is in front of the council building, obviously the most important governmental building in Florence. This, in fact, is chosen to show you because it is an image of Hercules and Cacus that is a physical statue, and also because of what clearly Hercules came to represent even after the Roman period had ended. This has actually been used as a metaphor. In the 16th century CE, the Medici family, a very powerful family, commissioned its creation as a symbol of their victory over Florence's republican government. So they had taken over Florence. Previously, Michelangelo's statue of David had been commissioned in order to commemorate Florence's republican government, taking it back from the Medicis. So this was sort of a retaliation in art. And they also had the statue made to look less violent than Hercules is normally shown. One, to make it look a bit more like the statue of David. This is colossal, by the way. It's about 5 meters tall. It doesn't look that big here, but it is huge. And it also makes the Medici look like they calmly just took over without any real harshness. And also, because we know Cacus is meant to be this horrible, horrible person who steals things, it kind of tells us what they thought about the republican government in the first place. In this second image, you might realise this is actually a Roman piece of art, because you've seen similar things before in the death and burial or journeying to the underworld topics. This is indeed a Roman sarcophagus, or the side of a Roman sarcophagus, carved from marble with these beautiful relief carvings. So they're sort of coming out of the marble. And it's from somewhere between 150 and 160 CE or AD. What we can immediately see here is an awful lot of men. And you might notice that on the left-hand side, they look kind of young, whereas they've got an older, bushier beard, you see, to the right. And if you look really closely, you'll start to notice things that are Herculean. So, for example, we see a strong, well-built man all the way through who is holding a club. He was wearing a lion's skin. And he actually appears to be getting older, showing the passage of time, which is just how he is shown on the metopes, on the Temple of Zeus at Olympia that we looked at in the Heracles version. This Roman marble sarcophagus is meant to represent Hercules completing most of his labours. So again, if you look closely, you can see the Nemean lion, who looks ditchy, frankly. We've also got the Hydra, it seems here, possibly actually as a woman, with this big snaky hair. We've also got the Erymanthian boar, so the third figure of Hercules here, who is wearing the Nemean lion skin. He's sort of holding the boar by its feet, and you can see Eurystheus in his pithos at the bottom there, just like in the metope. So it's possible they actually had the metopes as a bit of inspiration here, especially when we see the Cairnian hind. It's very, very similar to the image on the metope. Then we've got the Stymphalian birds. You can see in the hand that's raised there a bow for a bow to shoot arrows with, and one of the birds taking off there. It's a very different face there. It almost looks like a slightly different person. Then we've got a poor woman being crushed on the ground, looking up. That could well be the belt of Hippolyta, that particular labour. We've also got over here some horses, which I'm certainly assuming are the mares of Diomedes, especially as if you look at that horse at the very bottom. Not only does the horse at the very bottom right look like it has another horse coming out of its bottom, but that horse's head seems to be trying to bite the foot of the third Hercules from the end. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I think, Hercules here, all in various states of undress, but all showing the muscular body of the man. He is wearing his lion skin. He is holding the club, even though he barely seems to use the club in his labours. So we can see who it is. The question is, why? Why would you put this on a sarcophagus? Now, we saw the metaphor being used of Hercules and Cacus on the 16th century statue earlier. But here, why a sarcophagus? Hercules doesn't really go to the underworld, does he? Because he gets to become a god. But he does get to, oh yeah, and there's the Bull of Crete, by the way. He does get to go to the underworld in one of his labours, the one that's actually not pictured on this side of the sarcophagus, the one where he goes and he gets Cerberus. So this could be a good image for a sarcophagus, as Hercules also travelled to the underworld, and it shows him getting older and moving towards death. So it's the process of his life. That's quite a good topic for a sarcophagus, that is taking someone at the end of their life off to the underworld. It's also a great scene because it's heroic. Maybe the person who was buried in the sarcophagus really idolised Hercules, as many Romans did, and wanted to be like him. And so by putting him on their sarcophagus, it kind of makes the link that they were like him in life. So the prescribed sources. Now, as I said, I'm going to be reading these with my class in my live lessons, but we are going to make some notes first about what generally happens in the sources. So the first prescribed source for the Roman section of the Heracles topic is Hercules versus Cacus, the bit from Virgil's Aeneid. The text background: the story is told, the Hercules and Cacus story, within the wider narrative of Aeneas's journey to Italy. So the whole Aeneid is about Aeneas's journey to Italy and what happens when he gets there. But then this small section is a story within a story. It's told to Aeneas by Evander, king of the city of Pallanteum, to whom he has gone for help. And this place is technically where Rome is going to be. Rome's obviously an awful lot bigger than the tiny village-like cities that were there before. So we imagine it's not actually that far from where Aeneas has landed. Over time, Rome, when it is built, is going to spread out over all these particular areas. So the idea that Hercules visited the site that would become the site of Rome in the future is quite exciting. In a summary of the story, Hercules is actually on his way back from his 10th labour, the cattle of Geryon. So this actually does link it to the labours and puts it amongst the labours, but it's not one of the labours. It's a story that happens to him while he's on his way back from this. The labours are officially tasks set by Eurystheus. So this is another reason why this is called one of the lesser adventures of Hercules. He is driving the cattle back through the continent of Europe. We saw Geryon on the map, was sort of off the map somewhere. And so he's coming all the way back to Greece. And he travels through Italy, according to this version of the story. While he is resting, some of his cattle, or rather Geryon's cattle that he has stolen, are stolen again by the monster Cacus, who lives in a mountain, which is in fact going to be the Aventine Hill, one of the 7 hills of Rome in Rome's future. And he's a pretty horrible guy. He's a monster, right? He nails the heads of his victims to his doors. That's incredibly barbaric. The Romans would have seen this practice done by sort of tribes in the very furthest regions of the empire that they had to take over. Also, Cacus breathes fire. So he's a really interesting character because he doesn't seem to be human at all, except for his love of cattle. And he kills people, he's a murderer, he puts their heads on the door, that's going to stop them going to the underworld, that kind of thing, and he breathes fire. That's just crazy stuff. Hercules discovers the theft. There's a great bit of the story where the cattle all moo, and then he hears a lone moo from inside the mountain. Don't go without me, kind of moo. And then he finds out, there are these steps. Cacus thinks he's really clever. He thinks, I know, if I drag the cattle backwards into my mountain, the footprints they leave will look like they're coming out of the mountain. So he won't think to look inside. Yeah, Cacus isn't very clever. Hercules is clever. So obviously we're seeing two different types of brutality here, because Hercules, he doesn't actually use his cleverness so much. He mostly uses his anger. He is distraught and angry that his cattle have disappeared. So he goes to the mountain. He can't get in because Cacus has put a massive stone in front of the door, because Cacus is actually afraid. He's clearly met his match here, so that's building up Hercules for us. And Hercules, in fact, rips the top off the mountain, and then Cacus is breathing fire and smoke, so there's all this smoke coming out of the top of the mountain and the whole area is shaking. And then Hercules jumps down into the middle where the smoke is thickest, because that's where he thinks Cacus will be. And he gets Cacus and he strangles him until apparently his eyes bug out of the sockets and his blood stops running. It's a pretty graphic death. And then he brings the body out to show the locals and is praised, and they honour him like a god and set up the ritual worship of Hercules. Now, interestingly enough, this story was written down by Virgil at a time which predates the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. It is popular fact that Vesuvius was thought of as a mountain, not a volcano. They didn't really understand volcanoes at that point. They know Mount Etna was somewhat of a fire mountain and smoke came out of it, but they'd never gone through an eruption, or at least that's the general understanding. And this does sound like a volcano erupting, which is really interesting. Could they have made up this story of Hercules and Cacus to explain what has happened in the past? Who knows? In any case, it does show Hercules beating a type of monster. So when you're reading this, you've got to consider, how is Hercules presented in this source? Right at the end of this video, we'll have a think about those issues. Now, I get my class to then read an alternative version of this story, the story of Hercules versus Cacus, that comes from Livy. Now, Livy was not a poet, he was an historian, and he wrote the early history of Rome. He wrote right from the start. He says in his introduction, I don't really want to write about the stuff at the start because it's only myths and no one really believes it anyway. And you're only going to skip over that. Little did he know that we would find that the most interesting bit. So he says, look, I don't know if these stories are true, but he writes them down anyway as history. So it's quite interesting. Is it myth? Is it history? At what point does his history become real? History means you're writing facts down. He can't corroborate these as facts. Now, his version of this story, which apparently happened where Rome is cited, and that's why he includes it, it comes in chapter 1, verse 7. As you can tell, it's pretty early on in the beginning of Rome. And even though this isn't a prescribed source, I certainly find this interesting because the depictions of Hercules and Cacus, especially Cacus, are so different from the poetic, exciting story version that Virgil tells. There are several reasons for this. We can consider, who is the audience for this text? What is the writer trying to create for the reader with this text? How does that compare to the prescribed source extract from Aeneid that tells the same story but different? So we can think, well, for a start, Livy is a historian. He is trying to write down a history. He has heard these stories. He doesn't much believe them, but he's putting them in there anyway, kind of to be polite and to not miss anything out. He's trying to be really, really thorough. He is trying to create a history for the reader. So, spoiler, in the story, Cacus is just a shepherd who's gone bad and he steals stuff. That's rather different to a fire-breathing monster who lives in a mountain and, breathes fire and murders people and hangs their heads on doors. So how does that compare to the prescribed source? Well, it's more realistic for a start, and it's not presenting Hercules as this amazing warrior who fights monsters, but it's still presenting Hercules as a man who goes and ends fights. This guy, Cacus, is a danger to his community. Hercules takes him out. So he's still on the side of right. We can still be proud of Hercules as Romans, Livy is saying. But it's not as exciting. There's not as much entertainment value. And so that makes us think, right, so are the stories of Hercules more about Hercules doing the right thing? Or are they more about the entertainment value of telling stories about great heroes that we can only try and look up to being? You've kind of got the same endpoint, but through different methods. Next, the prescribed source, The Lesser Adventures of Hercules by Ovid in his Metamorphoses, which I spoke to you about earlier. These stories tell the later adventures of Hercules, including the ones that, spoilers, lead up to his death. Although he is deified, so it's okay. As we learned in the Homeric hymn to Heracles, the Lion-Hearted, in the Greek version, that was one of the prescribed sources there, he's going to get to go up to Olympus and live happily ever after with beautiful ankled Hebe as his wife. So we don't have to feel too sorry for him. There are 4 chapters that we look at. Hercules and Achelous, the shirt of Nessus, the agony of Hercules, and then the death and transformation of Hercules. Now, these stories are loosely chronological, as in they happen in this order in the text, and this is meant to reflect the life of Hercules. And the idea of reading these is, one, to see what happens. What does Hercules do in each situation? How does he end up dying? Whose fault is it? That sort of aspect of the story. You're not expected to quote from it necessarily, but you're expected to know the story in detail. Most of all, you need to consider in each of these lesser adventures of Hercules, how is Hercules being presented? What kind of man is he? What kind of hero is he? So I'm going to be reading these in detail with my class in our live lessons. But for now, I want them, and you, if you're joining along with us, to make notes to summarise each of these sections. This for my class will be useful because when we read them, it will be easier to understand what's happening in the text. So, Metamorphoses Book 9, lines 1 to 272, Hercules and Achelous. This story is actually told by Achelous, a river god, to Theseus, friend of Hercules. He's the one that he gives Hippolyta to get married to, if you remember way back in the Greek version, and the Amazonomachy. So in the Metamorphoses, Achelous is telling Theseus this story. He's explaining why he has a broken horn. I kind of want to know why he has a horn in the first place, seeing as most river gods are generally seen as just looking a bit human, but quite godlike. But anyway, he has a broken horn, right? So he has this broken horn, and Theseus goes, "Hey man, how did you break that horn?" It was apparently broken off by Hercules, and he's not even ashamed to say it because everyone knows Hercules is amazing. The fact that he's not dead and he fought Hercules is pretty impressive. So he's not completely embarrassed by this story. The story goes, Hercules and Achelous were both competing to marry Princess Deianira of Aetolia. Achelous is a river in Aetolia. I'm not going to go into how on earth a princess is meant to live with a river god. Just imagine it, okay? Oh, maybe don't imagine it. It's weird. All the other suitors, upon seeing that both Achelous, a river god, and Hercules, the greatest warrior they've ever known, are both competing for Deianira, they give up straight away and settle back to watch what will happen. But Hercules and Achelous refuse to give up. They don't want to yield to each other. So they start off by making arguments why they should be the one to marry Deianira. First of all, Hercules argues, I've got divine parentage. My daddy is Jupiter, because remember we're the Roman version now, so Jupiter instead of Zeus. And also I completed my 12, should have been 10, but still 12 heroic labours. So I'm a really good catch. And Archelaus goes, yeah, right. I'm an actual god, right? An actual god. And also, you had to do those labours because you killed your wife and family. So it's your own fault. And frankly, I don't believe that Jupiter is your daddy. Now, we know throughout history people have got very upset when people questioned their paternity because he's calling him technically a bastard. So they fight. Hercules is enraged, suggests they fight, basically just starts a fight straight away. I know I said earlier on Hercules doesn't start fights, he finishes them. But hey, Achelous is the one who started the fight here. Hercules is keen to end it. Achelous could not back down now. He can't say, I don't want to fight you, you're Hercules. He has to fight him. He will lose face completely if he doesn't. But he cheats. Water spirits seem to be able to change their shape. Thetis, the goddess who became the mother of Achilles, when she's captured by Peleus, she, as a water goddess, she's able to turn into different creatures, a sea snake, a seagull, a lion apparently at one point, in order to try and evade her captor. And Achelous seems to do the same thing here. He turns into different creatures. He turns into a snake. He turns into a bull. But Hercules, well, I've fought a snake before. I killed the Hydra, for goodness sake. I've caught a bull. I managed to catch the Cretan bull. So he knows what he's doing. And while Achelous is a bull, as you'll see here he is as a snake with one horn, which kind of suggests he already had the horn, right? I just realised that sounded really rude. I didn't mean that. He has a horn, right? And then in this particular piece of art, we see him again as this. I love this. Look at that. He's a bull, but with a human face. Oh, stuff of nightmares. And again, he's got that one horn. By the way, I'm using the images from theoi.com here, which is one of my favourite websites. It's a fantastic repository of all myth. I think it's all myth. It looks like it's pretty much all myth. They're sponsored by adverts. So obviously go have a look, let them get some cash because they've done an amazing job of putting all of these things together. These are both pieces of art. They are red figure craters and a red figure stamnos, these big jars. They're kept in different places now, but at least on theoi.com you can go and see them. In the second image, you can actually see Deianira, who's apparently pretty kick-ass herself. She's a really good charioteer. You can kind of see why Heracles would be attracted to that, or Hercules rather. She's standing there veiled up because, you know, she's a proper lady, but she's holding her regal scepter. And she's watching with interest as these two, I say men, not really sure about men, as they go to war over her. Interestingly, there's another horn on the floor, which suggests that Hercules has already pulled it off. Anyway, so that's how the horn gets broken anyway. When Hercules apparently snapped the horn from Achelous' head, it was immediately filled with plentiful foods and became the horn of plenty, the cornucopia. We see that in images of Demeter or Ceres, the Roman version, for example, that big, interesting, twisty horn that's full of fruit. The shirt of Nessus. Now, I say shirt here, but this could be the shirt, the tunic, or even the cloak of Nessus, and the story is told in lots of different ways. I'm just going to go with shirt here because that seems to be the most popular translation. So Hercules has won and wed Princess Deianira, and they are now returning home to Tiryns in Greece. But they have to cross a river, the river Evenus, and this river was very, very deep. Hercules could swim across, but Deianira could not. Then, as if by magic, the centaur Nessus suddenly appeared. Now, centaurs don't have a very good reputation. They tend to be violent and violent against women. However, Hercules has had experience with good centaurs, or specifically the centaur Chiron, who wasn't born in the same way as the other centaurs. So this is why perhaps he agrees when centaur Nessus appears, promising he can help Deianira across, you know, because he's part horse, he can ride through the water and she can sit on his back, that Hercules agrees. However, while Hercules is in the river, Nessus then does a really centaur-y thing and tries to run off with Deianira, probably to purport some violence against her. Hercules acts really, really quickly. He gets to the other side of the river, he takes out his bow and arrow, and he shoots an arrow at Nessus and hits him, missing Deianira mystifyingly. And Nessus starts to bleed all over his tunic, or his shirt. In revenge, before he dies, Nessus takes his tunic off and he gives it to Deianira. And he promises her that, sorry for trying to steal you away, I'm going to give you this object. This is a magical love token now that I've bled all over it. It will make the wearer fall back in love. It will make them fall in love again. It is a cure for waning love. And then he dies. That doesn't sound much like revenge. But ha! In fact, he's lying. It's actually poison. Dun, dun, dun. So, the Centaur Nessus does in fact actually appear in the Disney version of Hercules. There he is, again, not wearing a shirt. As you'll notice in this image of him with Deianira sitting on his back, we can't even see his face, not wearing a shirt. And this version, where again he is literally carrying with the arms on the front of his centaur body Deianira, who is reaching out for Heracles or Hercules, again not wearing a shirt. So I'm not entirely sure where the shirt bit comes in, but certainly fabric around him gets covered in blood. Now keep an eye on that fabric, because that's rather important to the next part of the story, the Agony of Hercules. This book, this chapter, is pretty savage. This story comes several years after the previous story of Hercules and Nessus and the poisoned shirt. Juno was acting up again. She was using rumour. Capital R means that this is a deification of rumour, kind of like a metaphor. Rumour is often seen in myth as being this weird creature with wings that's covered in ears, so it can listen out for tidbits, and then it can say those tidbits back and spread rumour and lies. And it's often used as a metaphor for things that sort of start civil wars and problems. So she gets rumour to spread, rumours, that Hercules and Deianira have an unhappy marriage. So much so that Deianira hears and starts to believe that Hercules is in love with, or even having an affair with, Iole, a princess from Thessaly, and Deianira is going to be replaced. Deianira, thinking she's going to lose her husband, whom she really loves, but also, a woman's status is very much dependent on who her husband is at this time. She goes and she finds the apparently love-reviving shirt that she was given from the period of time that, she spent with Nessus. However, she doesn't know that it's poison, and she gives it to Hercules' slave Cacus, so that he will give it to Hercules as something to wear, hoping that when Hercules puts it on, it will make him love her again. Unfortunately, it doesn't do that. Hercules puts it on, and he's making a sacrifice to the gods, and the heat from the altar fire makes the shirt stick to his skin. And that's when the agony of Hercules starts. The poison seeped into his skin, making it burn and blister. And we are told that the pain is tremendous. And in fact, then when he tries to pull off the shirt, it pulls off his skin. In fact, it pulls off his muscle to the bone. It's like the equivalent of getting a really bad scald and your skin comes off on your clothes. My mother endlessly told me stories about that as a kid so that I wouldn't pull pots of hot water off the stove. And Hercules goes into a lament. He goes crying to Juno, how dare you do this to me? It's not fair. Is this why I spent my whole life trying to do the right thing and the good thing and protect people and do all these amazing things and feats of strength? It's not how I'm expecting to die. Now, funnily enough, we don't really get a lot of images that seem to portray the agony of Hercules on Greek pots, so I've had to look elsewhere. This is a painting called The Death of Hercules by a chap called Francisco de Zurbarán in 1634. This is now in the Museo del Prado in Madrid. And this was a whole series of paintings about the life of Hercules that he did. And we can see here, he's painted Hercules in pain. The pain is literally flames. He is literally burning up. That's the idea of how completely agonising the wearing of the shirt is. Nessus has got his revenge from beyond the grave. And that leads us into the final chapter of this prescribed source, the death and transformation, metamorphosis, of Hercules. Hercules' pain continues into the story, and he takes out his anger and pain on the slave Lycas, thinking he has basically murdered him, and he hurls Lycas into the sea. If you've read Roald Dahl's Matilda, it's a bit like the Trunchbull, which picks up the poor little girl with the pigtails and swings her around like the hammer and throws her very, very, very far away. Imagine that. That's what Hercules does to Lycas. Again, he's acting on his anger and his pain. Then he builds himself a funeral pyre. Now, we know from the death and burial topic that that's what you put the dead body on, but he's not dead yet. He intends to cremate himself while he's still alive because he thinks that would be less painful. That really tells you he's gone to the ends of the earth to do his labours, but this is the final straw. He lit the pyre, and he lay on the pyre, and he waited to die. And it's at this point that Jupiter, remember we're in the Roman version now, so not Zeus, but Jupiter, sees his son Hercules in such pain and dying that Jupiter makes a speech, and he asks the rest of the gods if it would be okay to allow him to make Hercules immortal and bring him up to Olympus in return for all the good deeds he did on earth. We might see the labours as something he did, to avoid miasma or reduce his miasma from killing his wife and children. Well, it wasn't really fair that he had to kill them anyway because it was all Hera's fault. But what he was doing by that was getting rid of all of these potential threats to mankind. So he really was kind of saving mankind. And that's what Jupiter's argument is. And amazingly, the other gods agree, including Juno. They say, yes, it's actually a good idea. Let's make him immortal. And so Hercules, his body now having been consumed by the fire, it's like he's shed his mortal skin. He sheds his former life as a mortal and is brought up to Olympus and becomes a god. And there is a special word for this that I want you to note down. This is called his apotheosis, which means his elevation to divine status. He goes from being a mortal to being a god. We get this with the Roman emperors. They are deified after death. They have an apotheosis where they apparently go up and become gods. And I'll show you some images of that on the next slide from Greek art. This image is a woodcut from 1548. About wood print. Which shows poor old Hercules lying on his pyre, watched by his friend. I just thought this one's actually quite amusing. For a start, they're all naked for no real reason. And Hercules just looks like he's fallen asleep on a table and broken it, and it's caught fire. So I think this is rather amusing. But he does look restful. He's so much more at rest than he was in the previous painting, where he was literally on fire. Now he's literally on fire, but it's somehow less painful than the actual shirt of poison that he was wearing. This next slide shows this lovely piece of artwork. Here we've got a Attic red figure Pelike vase, and it's showing the death and apotheosis of Hercules. Or rather Hercules, although this is a Greek pot, so it technically is Heracles, but we're reading about Hercules. Sorry to be confusing. So above, we've got in the close-up version, Hercules. You can see he's there, young man there. He's been restored to his youth. He's got his club, again, that symbol that it's him. And he's also got the lion skin draped over his shoulder. You can just see his little feet at the end there. He's standing in a chariot next to Athene, who we can immediately recognise, a woman in her chariot here. She's got her helmet and she's got her spear in her hand. She's flying him up in this chariot to Olympus. So this is his apotheosis, where he's turned into a god. And we can see as well, it also depicts his death, as down below there's the pyre. It's a kind of messy pyre, but he was in a lot of pain when he was putting it together. And we seem to have some bearded men with pointy ears. These seem to be satyrs, one of which is holding a club, which is possibly even Hercules' club, looking at the pyre, where it's not a great image, and I can't find a better one, but it does look like Hercules has disappeared. So this is attributed to the Cadmos painter, and it's one of the only images I certainly can find of the apotheosis of Hercules. So in all of these stories, how is Hercules presented? Well, He's pretty quick to anger. His reactions to Cacus in Virgil's Aeneid, in the story of him versus Cacus, he literally tears the top off a mountain and then crushes the guy practically to death around his neck. His reaction to Achelous is to immediately fight him and rip off a piece of his horn. His reaction to Lycas, who hasn't really done anything wrong, is to throw him Trunchbull style across into the sea. And basically, yes, he dies. And his reaction to being his skin on fire is to curse Juno and call down upon her. And she's a god. And you're not really meant to do that to gods because they could do really bad things to you. Although, to be honest, this is probably the worst thing he can think of happening to him. So he lost cause. He's also powerful and strong. Of course, that's a given. He beats Cacus. He beats Achelous. He throws Lycas. If we put that with all the other times he's been really impressive and powerful and strong, that does seem to be his main characteristic. He's also very popular. His death is very vivid and drawn out, which makes us feel a lot of pathos for him. We feel really sorry for him because it's such an awful way to die. And then when he makes his speech saying, why am I dying like this? We still feel pathos for him. And the fact that the gods even feel pathos for him. Jupiter is his father, but he manages to convince the rest of the gods, including Juno, to allow him to come to Olympus. And Jupiter is proud of his son, and Zeus, the Greek version as well, which we get from Ovid, and we get from the Homeric hymn to Heracles that read in the Greek version. And he's clearly worthy of being a god. He gets to have that apotheosis, and even Juno seems to agree. And then on Olympus, he's rewarded with Hebe as a bride, beautiful ankled Hebe. Again, we get that from the Homeric hymn to Heracles. One thing that might be a little bit different to the Greek versions is whether or not he's actually as clever, whether he uses his intelligence as much as in those Greek versions. Even on that Greek pot we literally just looked at, Athene was there, but we certainly didn't really see her represented in the stories that we read in the Ovid. Brain versus brawn. Brawn is the strength and sort of bodyful nature of him. Is he really using that? He seems to be relying more on brute strength and his anger to get him through these situations. So that's something to think about when we compare the Greek and the Roman versions of this universal hero. He might be universal to both of these grand cultures, but with just slight differences.